Good morning. My name is Maggie Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement here at the National World War II Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunchbox lecture. Our lecture today is entitled Remembering Pearl Harbor, Native Hawaiian History, and a Day That Will Live in Infamy, with David Anthony Chang, PhD, Distinguished McKnight Professor at the University of Minnesota. Today's lecture rethinks the attack on Pearl Harbor from the perspective of Native Hawaiian history. Seen from Hawaii, the attack comes into sight as an event in the conflict between the American and Japanese empires in the Pacific, and as a turning point that would change the history of Hawaii, bringing out statehood in 1959. At the same time, the lecture explains why Native Hawaiians remember different attacks, the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the 1898 annexation by the United States, as being the real turning points in their history. This Lunchbox lecture is a part of the National World War II Museum's 80 Days of Commemorating Pearl Harbor campaign for the 80th anniversary of this significant event in our nation's history, as well as a part of the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program. So without further ado, I will now play this lecture that Dr. Chang pre-recorded for us to share more about the Native Hawaiian perspective on the attack at Pearl Harbor. He will be joining us live at the conclusion of this pre-recorded lecture for a live Q&A. So please, as you are watching and have any questions that come to mind, please feel free to go ahead and place your questions if you're watching on Facebook as a comment or within the Q&A feature on Zoom.
Hello, my name is David Chang, and I'm really pleased to be talking with you today. I am a professor in the History Department at the University of Minnesota and also in the American Indian Studies Department at the University of Minnesota. And it's a pleasure to be joining you for this lecture with the National World War II Museum and also with the benefit of the Organization of American Historians. This lecture is part of a program of the Organization of American Historians, whereby professional historians bring lectures to the interested public. And so I appreciate this invitation today to speak with you. Today we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor. And the title of my talk today is Remembering Pearl Harbor, Native Hawaiian History and a Day That Will Live in Infamy. And so remembering Pearl Harbor is a way of thinking about different ways that we remember the events that happened at Pearl Harbor, the way that different people do. And this matters a lot to me because I teach from Indigenous history, and also I am a Native Hawaiian person. And so my relationship to the events that happened on December 7th, 1941 in Pearl Harbor may be different. And I think they're important for understanding the meaning of that war, the meaning of that attack, and the meaning of the war that followed. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. Now, the title I take from a very famous song. It came out in 41, a number of people recorded it, in 42, came out in 1942. And because I don't want to switch around screens too much, I'd like to play a recording from 1942, but it might be a little bit better if I just sing you a couple bars myself, which will be painful for you. But, you know, just you're gonna have to put up with that. So this was a big hit in 42, and many of you know it. Sing along if you do. History in every century records an act that lives forevermore. We'll recall as into line we fall the thing that happened on Hawaii's shore. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo, and so on and so forth. I'll stop it there. This song was immediately after the events, saying that the memory of Pearl Harbor was going to be a motivating force for Americans, those that were on the front lines and those that were on the home front. It is calling that memory as a motivating force in the war effort. So memory was already a political force, and the memory of Pearl Harbor was going to matter. But notice here that there's another memory going on as well. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we did the Alamo. Now, this is kind of telling, I think. What was the Alamo? Of course, in the Texas Revolution, in which American settlers in Texas, which was part of the Mexican state of Coahuila, Texas, occupied the Alamo garrison in San Antonio, Texas, as part of an effort to create, at that time, an independent country. So the Alamo is a memory for Americans of defense. But the events of what happened at the Alamo are, in Texas and in Mexican history, the memory of American imperialism and colonialism into Texas, and specifically the effort to create an independent republic where slavery would be possible because the Mexican federal government had made it illegal, and American settlers in Texas wanted to continue their process of slavery, which they had brought from the American South. So therefore, notice the layering of memories here. And also notice that there's a layering here of thinking of the Alamo as a defensive war, if you will, or a defensive battle, if you will, when in fact, the history is a lot more complicated. And it's much more tied into the competition between powers, Mexico and the United States, for authority over a native place, for authority over indigenous lands, for authority over African bodies, then people might want to remember. So the memory of the Alamo, like the memory of Pearl Harbor, is important, but it's complicated. So when people, so I just want to use that as our framing here. So let's start at the USS Memorial, the USS Arizona Memorial. I'm going to assume that a lot of you have been there, or that many of you would like to go. 1.8 million visitors go to visit the Arizona every year, which is a phenomenal number, but not me. And I've been to Hawaii many times. Not my father. And he grew up in Hawaii and returned and returned and returned, and he'd never been there. And not my siblings, not my brothers and sisters, not my cousins. So in other words, this is a place that many people go, but as for my family, which is deeply connected to Hawaii and to Honolulu, which is the base of my family and my extended family, is not been a site of visitation, a site of commemoration, a site of memory. And that's not because we don't remember it. My father remembered it prior to his passing quite clearly. He remembered the sounds of the bombs that started falling on the harbor on 7:45, 7:50 on Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941, when he was on his way to 8 o'clock Mass at St. Patrick's Church in Honolulu. You could hear the thud from far away coming up the valley. So it's not that we don't remember Pearl Harbor, but it means a different thing to us, perhaps. And that different memory is important for understanding what the attack on Pearl Harbor meant. And there are other events that we remember and we commemorate more powerfully, and that we speak to, that speaks to how we would shape the events of the early 20th century. So today I want to use this talk to rethink the attack on Pearl Harbor from the perspective of Native Hawaiian history, because it happened on Native Hawaiian land, because Hawaii is Native Hawaiian land. Seen from Hawaii, the attack comes into sight as an event in the conflict between two empires, the American and the Japanese empires in the Pacific. And it's also seen as a turning point that would change the history of Hawaii, encouraging the move to the imposition of United States statehood on Hawaii in 1959. At the same time, I want to use today as a chance to explore why Native Hawaiians, why Kanaka, Maui, as we say in our language, remember different attacks. The attacks in the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the attack of the 1898 annexation by the United States, why we remember these different attacks as real turning points in Hawaiian history. So what was Pearl Harbor? If this were a live lecture, I'd love to ask you guys and open it up and say, ask people what Pearl Harbor was and what it means to you. But you know, the obvious answer when I'm teaching this is that Pearl Harbor was an attack by the Japanese Empire on U.S. forces that were centered in the Pacific, in a place called Pearl Harbor in English, that happened in early December 1941, as Japan had already expanded its power in the Pacific quite a bit, was anticipating doing some more, and wanted to take out a good part of the American forces in the Pacific in order to allow it to proceed in those efforts for a while before what they anticipated was going to inevitably be a protracted fight with the United States. So that's kind of where this goes when I'm doing a live talk. And undoubtedly, there's this real truth to that sense of Pearl Harbor. But the thing is about that, it's very important, is my students always say it was an attack on America. They always say it was an attack on America. And this is really important to keep in mind because we need to think about where Pearl Harbor is. It's part of Oahu, the island of Oahu, in the islands of Hawaii, and where Hawaii is. Where is Hawaii when we look at it at a global scale? The answer is not in America. This was not an attack on America in the way that it can be understood geographically in any sense. America is North America, and Hawaii is very, very far from America. It's not in North America. It's nearly 3,000 miles from the continental United States. But of course, I do understand that we often use America now to refer to the United States. So when my students are telling me it was an attack on America, what they mean is it was an attack on US forces. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, it's important to remember that Hawaii was not a state of the United States. It was an occupied territory of the United States. That is a territory that the United States occupied, but it was not part of the United States per se. It was not a state. So that gives us kind of a little perspective that is important to keep in mind. America was not attacked on December 7th, 1941. If by America, we mean America, North America. If by that, we mean the states of the United States of America, they were not attacked. United States military forces who were occupying Hawaii were attacked on December 7th, 1941. That's what the attack was. So let's reorient ourselves geographically. Clearly, that's what I'm trying to do. So here's a map of the Hawaiian Islands stretching from Hawaii Island in the southeast all the way up to Niihau in the northwest. These are the principal islands. Of course, there are smaller islands. And these islands are located in the north central Pacific and are one of the most isolated large land masses in the world. And the Hawaiian Islands have been occupied for centuries and centuries by Native Hawaiian people, who are Pacific Islanders. And that place became a kingdom in the 19th century. And here are pictures of the monarchs of the Hawaiian Kingdom, from Kamehameha I to his son, Liholiho, Kamehameha II, stretching through Kamehameha III, the fourth, the fifth, Lunalilo, Kavika Kalakaua, David Kalakaua, and the last reigning monarch of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, the Queen of Hawaii, who was the queen at the time of the attacks that I'm going to be bringing up to you later on. So Hawaii in the 19th century was an independent kingdom. And it was a kingdom that was jealously and assertively and proactively creating and defending its independence against the rise and the push of empires that surrounded it, or empires that were far away, but whose forces were definitely trying to attack it, definitely trying to get control of it. A very important place in the history of this story is a place called Pu'uloa. and Waimomi. Pu'uloa and Waimomi are near Honolulu and were important sites coming in off Malama Bay with a series of locks connected to a channel that went out into the main part of the sea. This was a rich place, rich in sea life, rich in oysters. It was an excellent place from which to draw food. And it's renowned in numbers of songs and stories for its geography, its topography, and sacred events and things that sacred beings that inhabit that place. So this is Pu'uloa. It's the place that, as Waimomi, which means the water of the pearls, is remembered in English as Pearl Harbor. And it was important to Hawaiians for a number of reasons that had to do with the wealth, the food, the sacredness of various beings associated with it. But it was also important to foreigners for other reasons. It was a natural, deep harbor that could, with far less work than most places in that area, be transformed into a deep water harbor that would serve the purposes of shipping, both commercial shipping and ultimately, of course, military installations. So why did Pearl Harbor, a site in an independent Hawaiian kingdom, end up in some way being a first footstep, a first foothold for the American empire in the independent Hawaiian kingdom? There was a reciprocity treaty in 1875 that was worked out between King David Kalakaua and his representatives. Kalakaua is seated at the center of this photograph in his regalia, and representatives of the United States. Hawaiian sugar, or sugar that was grown in Hawaii, would enter the United States tax-free. This was an important economic boon for certain interests in Hawaii. And most particularly, those interests were the sugar plantations that were going to expand rapidly. They already existed, but would expand rapidly in reaction to this new duty-free market that they had access to, the US, which of course taxed imported foreign sugar. The demand for imported sugar had increased in the United States, and the year 1875 is not coincidental. During during the Civil War, sugar produced in the American South was no longer available in the North. The sugar supply had been interrupted. And in the aftermath of this, the push for a ready access to sugar increased. Also, emancipation in the American South, the end of slavery in the American South, called into question the future availability of sugar as well. So there was a push for imported sugar. So the US got access to sugar. Hawaii's planters, who were foreigners, largely white Americans, and sugar mill owners, this is their intermeshed businesses, got access to a ready market. And the US got in exchange a prize, a remarkably important and historically important prize. And that was, it secured a long-term lease to Pearl Harbor for its use. It would therefore be able to transform the locks of Pu'uloa and Waimomi into a deep water harbor where not only would commerce go, but also, of course, military boats, gunboats, the boats of the expanding United States Navy. This was a period of extraordinary expansion for the American military and maritime world, as under the influence of Admiral Mahan, who looked and saw that the future of the United States and the future of global power would be that of naval power. In emulation of the British Empire and in recognition of the far-flung nature of power at this period, the US built up its navy. And Waimomi, Pu'uloa, now renamed by the United States Pearl Harbor, would become central to that effort, much to detriment of Hawaii. So what did this mean? It meant a number of things. First of all, the Pearl Harbor was going to be there. Second of all, there was a dramatic expansion of the production of sugar. Dramatic expansion of the production of sugar depended on the demanded on enormous labor. And this also helps us tie the story of Pearl Harbor into the history of empires, because we want to think about who the workers were on the plantations. Okay, initial workers, and there were always Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian people who worked on the plantations. But because of epidemic disease and because many did not want to work on plantations, and also because of the enormous demand of the expanding plantations, there wasn't enough Native Hawaiian labor to work on those plantations. So US planters, American planters, sought, with the help of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, to bring laborers from around the world to work the plantations to make the profits work. So where did these workers come? After the 1875 treaty, American-owned sugar plantations expanded rapidly. Workers were imported from China, Japan, Okinawa, Philippines, Korea, Azores, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere. Let me talk about a few of those places, if I can, and help you understand how this is an imperial story. Because a world of empires can be seen in the imported laborers. We often talk about Portuguese workers in Hawaii, but the people that came to work in Hawaii were not Portuguese from continental Portugal by and large. They were largely from the Azores, a Portuguese colony 850 miles from Portugal. We also talk about Puerto Rican workers. And indeed, workers did come from Puerto Rico, 800 miles from the colonial power which ruled it, and that was the United States. We talk about Philippine workers, and yes, workers did come from the Philippines. Many came from the Philippines. They also came from a colonial occupied territory, an imperial occupied territory, the Philippine archipelago being 7,300 miles from the United States. So in other words, Hawaii was an imperially occupied spot that was part of a global economy in which there was a circulation of labor between empires. As a growing economy in Hawaii, owned by American sugar planters, imported laborers from around the globe, and in those laborers themselves, in their homelands, the Philippines and Puerto Rico, the Azores Islands, and there are other examples as well, we can see how this is a site of imperial action in Hawaii. That imperial action is at the core of the troubles that the Hawaiian Kingdom is already facing in the 1870s, had been for decades, and would face an even more intensified way in the coming decades. On your left, you have a picture of Queen Liliuokalani, who stands in all of her dignity, and with her embodiment as the monarch, embodies the nation. She embodies in this portrait, as she must do as a monarch, the dignity of her nation, the resoluteness of her nation, the maturity of her nation, the intelligence of a nation. So she stands there, and I want you to see, yes, you can see her clothes and how she can reference that she is perfectly capable of dealing, given her Western clothing, of dealing and conferring with Western powers. But also what I really want you to see is her pose. I want you to see her gaze. This is a performance of sovereignty. And when the sovereign monarch performs that sovereignty, she is performing it not only for herself, she is demonstrating it to the world and to those powers which might challenge her and might challenge her nation. That's what you see on the left. But what you see on the right, of course, is very different. What you see on the right is a caricature of a racist caricature, a racist and misogynist caricature of a woman that looks nothing at all like the queen, like Kamo'ivahine Liliuokalani. She has all of the markers of savagery and backwardness that one might expect. One sees her bare feet, her naked arms. One sees her feathers, the leaves. One sees the clothes that are kind of haphazardly, apparently, put upon her. And one sees a crown askew, looks like a costume crown. And one sees especially her face, marked with all of the racist imagery of late 19th century caricature, and with the thick lips, the protruding eyes, the wide nose. Okay, so she's being tied here. And because she embodies Hawaiʻi, Hawaiʻi is being tied here to the world of savagery, to the world of racial inferiority. The idea is Kanaka Hawaiians are like Indians. Their land can be taken. They are like Black people. Their labor can be taken. They are like all brown and dark-skinned people in that they are liable to colonialism and to control. Notice that there's an attack here also in the documents she's holding on her hands on her efforts to fight back against the push by settlers in Hawaii, by white American and other and European settlers in Hawaii to undermine the constitutional authority of the constitutional monarchs of Hawaii, which the previous monarch, Kawika Kalakaua, had to endure. And her effort to rebuild the sovereignty of her nation. She's holding in her left, in her document that is to our right, the document says scandalous government. And in her right one that says gross immorality. So her efforts to defend the sovereignty of her nation are shown as misgovernment. Her government is inherently misgovernment in the same way that her person and her nation in this caricature is portrayed as inherently inferior. So this is what Hawaii is facing in the 1780s and the 1790s, is this attack that's been that's gained power as the plantations are gaining power and as the white planters are gaining power. Planters who were themselves, many of them, in the most largest, the sugar factors, descendants rather, children and grandchildren of the Congregationalist missionaries who came from New England to Hawaii beginning in 1820. This culminated in a coup called the Overthrow in 1893, and in 1898 with an annexation. The coup created a white-ruled government called the Republic of Hawaii. Remember the history of Texas, which was evoked earlier in this talk when I talked about Alamo. Just like in Texas, the first thing that the people who overthrew the Hawaiian government did, just like they did in Texas, was to set up first an independent country. But the goal of that was not to create an independent Hawaiian republic. It was ultimately, the goal was to become annexed to the United States. It took 5 years to make that happen because of the politics of the United States. But in 1898, the United States declared itself declared itself the rulers of Hawaii. Now, we could get into the legal history of this, which is extraordinarily contentious. Suffice it to say that Hawaii, there was never a treaty of annexation. So Hawaii is, in a legal sense, was never annexed to the United States in any legal sense. It was militarily occupied. But because there was only a joint document of Congress that declared that this would be U.S. territory, one cannot say that it was annexed in any kind of orthodox sense, and therefore its legality is continuously called into question, quite rightly so. So 1893, 1898. So the question is, why did this happen? Now, on the one hand, I've emphasized the agricultural history of Hawaii and how it's setting up Pearl Harbor as this site. And I'll stand by that because these planters were so important. So this was what was important for them. But what was in it for the United States? What was in it for the United States was not just the protection of some planters, because the fact is, sugarcane and pineapple can be grown elsewhere. And the planters that were there, yes, they were Americans, but they only had so much political pull. I think it's really important to look at this document from shortly after purported annexation that maps the importance of Hawaii in an American newspaper. Honolulu and Pearl Harbor, vital centers of America's power on Pearl Harbor, map of the Pacific. On the left, it says Hawaii commands the whole Pacific. This is where Pearl Harbor, American colonialism come together. So ultimately, I want to say that the American annexation of Hawaii was less about the story of agriculture and agricultural planters than we often emphasize, and more about Pu'uloa, Waimea, Pearl Harbor, because as the lower left of this newspaper page says, Pearl Harbor Station, protection for America, showing the maritime dominance that Pearl Harbor could make possible. And not just a long-term lease on Pearl Harbor, but no, the complete political control via American domination of Hawaii, making more secure this Navy, this naval dominance. As the headline on the right says, backed by Navy, America in Pacific is impregnable. All right. Interesting choice of words, impregnable. But the power of the United States, the naval power, is inherently tied to this. So this is the spot that got attacked on December 7th, 1941. This is the history of that spot. And this is why, to a certain extent, this is the very important beginning of a story that's going to culminate in 1941 and then in 1959. So Hawaii became an American colony. It was first and foremost, I would argue, a military asset. It was also an economic asset to the United States. Its government was an elected territorial government for interior purposes with very limited powers and very strong oversight from the United States, with one non-voting member in Congress. And it had a racial profile very different from the US, from North America, okay, from the states. It was minority white. It had a large indigenous population. And in addition to this, because of the importation of so much labor to work the plantations and other migration into Hawaii from Asia, a very large Asian population. So that territory served the purposes of the United States, but it was somewhat different. And it was unlikely to become a state very quickly, in large part because of that racial difference. Many Americans, white Americans, did not want majority non-white states. We see this conversation also in the question of the statehood for New Mexico. Earlier on in the century, we see it contemporaneously. This is a very important element of the conversation about statehood for the District of Columbia and the question of Puerto Rican statehood. There are other questions involved as well, of course, but I really want to emphasize the question of race and statehood is important. So Hawaii was both of the United States in that it was a colony, but it was not the United States in that it was not a state. And because of its racial difference, there was going to be a question about how stateable that they could be, though there were arguments coming up already. So let's skip to this picture. And here we have a picture at the let's say 1940. And we have a picture of empires. And what you can see are circles and dates. And those are the dates that different lands came under the control of different empires at different times, okay? You've got the British Empire. You've got the Dutch Empire. You've got the Spanish Empire. You've got the Japanese Empire, and you've got the American Empire. The American Empire in that soft blue that is to the left, to the right, rather. And you've got much of the Japanese Empire in red to the left. Okay. So this is the Pacific. It's not America. This is the Pacific, and this is the world of which Hawaii was the easternmost edge. A Pacific world, an oceanic world, and a world of naval power. Why did Japan attack the US base at Pearl Harbor? As U.S. as people who are fascinated by World War II, I imagine that you, the audience, have a very strong sense of why they did. It was to knock out this base of naval power in the U.S. As I said at the beginning, in anticipation of eventual war between the U.S. and Hawaii, because this was the seat of American naval power in the Pacific. So on December 7th, 1941, came the attack. And this famous photograph shows you kind of the outline of, it gives you the picture that we famously remember from this attack. Japanese aircraft carriers brought planes within striking range of Hawaii. They launched 353 Japanese fighter planes. There were 8 US battleships in the harbor. All were damaged, 4 were sunk. They sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 188 US aircraft were destroyed. Most devastating for the United States, 2,402 American personnel were killed, 1,282 were wounded. The Japanese lost very little in the battle. Japanese losses were light, 29 aircraft, 5 mini submarines, 65 servicemen killed or wounded. 1 Japanese sailor was captured. Spared in the attack were 3 US, or surviving the attack, I should say, were 3 US aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. So how was this event remembered? It was remembered from the start in the following manner, these famous words from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking towards the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Now, of course, Japan was formerly known as the Empire of Japan, but I would like to emphasize that Roosevelt is emphasizing that word. The word empire, emperor comes up here strongly, and there's an implicit contrast with what American power meant. He said, yesterday, the Japanese government also launched as an attack against Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. Always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. Now, so the memory is, the call to memory is happening, but also the definition of memory is important here. Because it's a surprise offensive on the nation. But what were the nations involved? Let's look at these places. To attack Hong Kong was to a holding of the British Empire, Guam, the US Empire, the Philippines, a commonwealth which was under the very strong domination of the US Empire with a strong military presence in the United States. Midway Island also as well. To go up to the top, Malaya, which is under British rule. And shortly thereafter, Singapore also under British rule. So Japan is yes, attacking places in the Pacific, but it's one empire attacking the holdings of other empires, because this is a site of inter-imperial struggle where the people and the interests of Malayans, of Chinese in Hong Kong, of Chamorro in Guam, of Filipinos in the Philippines, of Pacific Islanders in Wake Island, Mid-Island, who were living there, and of Kanaka Maoli, of Native Hawaiians in Hawaii, were of secondary, tertiary, or one could argue not of importance at all to the US in understanding who was attacked. It was their homelands that were attacked on that day. But it was an argument among empires that Roosevelt was calling into memory. So Hawaii's place in the war in the Pacific is also, again, probably well known to you, as people are aficionados of World War II, as the most important staging point for the counteroffensive against the Japanese Empire across the Pacific, leading ultimately to the painful, long, and horrid the effort to push back the Japanese occupation of these many islands and archipelagos, push close to the Japanese homeland, culminating in the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Japan to force Japan into surrender. Hawaii's place was essential. Hawaii's place was essential as the staging point after the victory in Europe for the really major push against Japanese forces across World War II. Lest we forget that this mattered a lot in a couple of other different ways for Japanese and people of Japanese descent, Japanese Americans who were living in US occupied places, whether that be the continental United States or its territories elsewhere. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, white civilian and military officials doubted the loyalty of Japanese Americans in the West and considered them to be security risks. Concerns of racial bias were very much at the center of this. Lieutenant General John DeWitt, who administered the imprisonment program, testified in Congress, "I don't want any of them here," them being the Japanese. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still a Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty, but we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. He quite simply and more directly repeated, a Jap is a Jap. Even adopted Japanese orphans would be interned in the end. So this led, of course, to the imprisonment of Japanese Americans across the West Coast, according to Executive Order 9066 of February 19th, 1942, which interned Japanese in this zone. Under that order, 1,200 Japanese were removed from their homes and mostly into camps in North America, in the United States. They were called, at that time, these were called concentration camps, though they were not death camps. They were concentration camps. And the imprisonment of people, 2/3 of them citizens, under no charges. It was an unprecedented attack on the American Constitution, but it was understood by almost all Americans except Japanese Americans as part of the defense of America. It was, of course, a crisis for the American Constitution, and it remains an important site of memory in thinking through this war. How did this happen in Hawaii? Hawaii's situation was different. Japanese were a very important part of the plantation labor population. And after plantation labor, many Japanese, like many others, moved out into the civilian economy. Okay, and Japanese living in Hawaii became an important part of that economy, that world, and that society. In Japan, in Hawaii, there were 150,000, there were more than 150,000 Japanese Americans who comprised over 1/3 of the population of Hawaii. Only 1,200 were in charge. Almost all of those who were arrested were male leaders of the immigrant community, Buddhist priests, Japanese language teachers, Japanese newspaper editors, Japanese leaders of community organizations were among them. There were a handful of women also who were arrested. Some of them were Nisei, second generation. Some of them were Kibe, who were born in the US, but educated in Japan. I bring this up because I want to point out exactly I think it's really important for us to remember this episode in the history of the United States and World War II history, and how core race and an indelible nation of racial nationhood was here. That these Americans were not actually Americans, but also to emphasize that Hawaii was profoundly different. And the prosecution of the war, and even the prosecution of the imprisonment of the Japanese population, was different in Hawaii. But now I want to switch to thinking about what Hawaii did. All of that transshipment, what World War II did to Hawaii, all of that transshipment of American soldiers through Hawaii, all of that training, all that buildup of materiel, all that staging ground work led to an intensification of US military occupation of Hawaii and the seizure of lands during and after the war that should serve Native Hawaiian people. On your left, you see a map. I think it's from 2018. It's a touch out of date, but things have not changed much. And that's Oahu. Over 20% of Hawaiʻi land is occupied by the United States government. Only over 20% of Hawaiʻi land is illegally occupied by the United States government. On the map on the left, you see military lands, active military lands. In orange, you see lands that are contaminated and mined with civilian access forbidden. In yellow, you see lands that were planned for expansion of military lands. Now, what were these lands? This on the right, you see a map from the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 1880s, and it's a map survey, and it's showing government lands and crown lands. Now, I want you to notice that there is a very strong overlap between the lands, the crown lands and government lands and US military occupied territory. The reason for that is the United States seized for itself these lands when it declared itself the sovereign after it declared that it had annexed Hawaii. Now, those lands were there to serve the Hawaiian people and should, and many lawyers are now convincingly, arguably, not truly US property, but they are, like Hawaii, US occupied, like the archipelago as a whole, US occupied. World War II led to this intensification. Pearl Harbor was just a foothold. World War II made Hawaii's strategic importance even more important and more obvious. The Cold War argued for rapid and continuous military buildup. And even today, long after the end of the Cold War, Hawaii remains a major military outpost to the point where you see this much land taken, seized, and continually occupied illegally by the United States. So how did that intensification proceed during the war? Martial law was declared December 7th, 1941. It continued until October 24th, 1944. Curfews, the suspension of civil laws and civil rights, habeas corpus was suspended. The application of military law was applied to civilians. Hundreds of thousands of US military came into the islands. And of course, now Hawaii remains incredibly militarized. This is an important part of this story. Now, in the complex part of the story, many of you have also heard of the 442nd Infantry Regiment. Here you have a picture of some of the young men of that. This infantry regiment was almost entirely Japanese from Hawaii. They fought in the European theater. They were the most decorated infantry regiment in the history of the United States Army. The 442nd was awarded 8 presidential citations. 21 of its members were awarded the Medal of Honor for World War II. The 442nd's high distinction in the war and its record-setting decoration count earned it the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion. The 442nd's regimental combat team's motto was, "Go for broke." One of the reasons it must be noted that they were so highly decorated was that they were often used in the most desperate circumstances. And one wonders if military commanders thought that perhaps Japanese life, Japanese American life, was less precious than white American life. And they were thrown into very difficult circumstances because of their race. But one cannot doubt the dedication of these soldiers to the United States either. One can think about it in complex terms, but one has to note that these are these are young men of a very complex position. Their parents, perhaps their grandparents, came from Hawaii, very likely not from the Japanese mainland itself, but from Japanese occupied Ryukyu, and because they were, again, inter-imperial migrants. And now they're fighting on behalf of a country that is on behalf of the United States Empire. This is also important in my family, and I think about my Uncle Bill. My Uncle Bill was a Filipino American from Maui, and he was an American patriot, and he was career Navy. I come from a family with a lot of military experience, both grandfathers in World War I, uncles in the Korean War, and His parents were plantation workers on the island of Maui. He would come from the colony of the Philippines to the colony of the United States, and he fought on behalf of the imperial power, which occupied the place where he lived. And he married a Native Hawaiian woman, my auntie, and he fought vigorously on behalf of this and became an American patriot. So there is a very important and interesting story here of the identification and the fighting of these individuals for the United States. And I think that it's important to recognize that and think about it. I'm willing to talk more about it. The World War II led to an intensification of the militarization of the United States. More of Hawaii, more Americans witnessed Hawaii and were there firsthand. It transformed Hawaii, accelerated its connection to the United States. And Hawaii statehood came in 1949. And the roots of Hawaii statehood can be found in World War II. It came from this story. It came also, I would argue, that the continually saying that America had been attacked at Pearl Harbor made Hawaii effectively seem like America to Americans in a way that it had not on December 6th, 1941. That arguing that Hawaii was America, even though it was an occupied territory of the United States, intensified the process of making it a state of the United States. So here we are today. With an intensely militarized archipelago with important military bases around it and training grounds. Pearl Harbor is not just a memorial. It's not just Arizona, but a very active, very important global site of global power for the United States. One of the most important. And yet, and it's remembered and celebrated, and yet that remember Pearl Harbor is not the memory that matters the most to many people in Hawaii. Not the memory that matters most to me when I think about attacks on Hawaii. Though its history is tied to the history of American occupation. And that is the attack that is remembered among Native Hawaiians. Oh, let me go back to slideshow. I think I just messed up my view. There we go, that's better. Okay, so this is a song. Remember Pearl Harbor is not a song that Native Hawaiians sing, in my knowledge. What they do sing, what we do sing, is a song that's still well known. It was written in 1895 by Ellen Kaho'ohiro Kalani Prendergrass, a Native Hawaiian woman, and it's called Kaulana Napua. Famous are the flowers, or famous are the children. It's often remembered also as the Stone Eater song. It is a patriotic Hawaiian song, which is still sung today. It's still danced to today in hula, and inspires and quickens hearts today. And it goes, Kaulana Napua o Hawaii, kupa ama hope o ka aina, hiki mai ka elele o koloko ino, pala pala anunu me ka pakaha. And it goes on. And this song comes right between the 1893 overthrow of the kingdom and the 1898 declaration by the United States that had annexed Hawaii. And what is it saying? It is a call on Native Hawaiian people, the children of Hawaii, to be ever loyal to the land and to resist the calls of the evil-hearted messengers, the messengers of the American Empire, and the messengers of the agents of that empire, in this case, the agents of the Republic of Hawaii, which was seeking annexation, and to resist all documents and all monies that would seek support for that republic and for the annexation that it was seeking. And so it calls on the people of Hawaii Island, the people of Maui, the people of Kauai, the people of Oahu, and of all of the other islands in the second stanza, to resist and to not sign a paper that would swear any allegiance to that paper of the enemy in the third sentence, to resist annexation and the sale, the abandonment, the seizure of native civil rights. In the fourth sentence, it declares that Hawaiians do not value any kind of wealth that might come from annexation, but are themselves satisfied in this incredible turn of phrase. Ua lava mako I ka pōhaku, I ka ai kamahao o ka aina. We are satisfied with the stones, the astonishing food of the land. In other words, Hawaiians would rather eat the stones provided to them by their homeland than eat the food that would be provided from the imperial colonizer. Why? Because they back Liliuokalani, last verse, who will be crowned again. So it's a call again for the restoration of the Hawaiian Kingdom, which means the restoration of Hawaiian sovereignty. This is what Hawaiians remember more than Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor mattered dramatically to the history of the Hawaiian people. It mattered dramatically because it accelerated the American occupation of the kingdom. It made Hawaii a target for the Japanese Empire. In the pushing back of the Japanese Empire, it made Hawaii an even larger place, take an even larger place in American imperial and colonial power around the globe. And Pearl Harbor remains central to American domination of Hawaii. And yet, it's the story that's a larger part of for Native Hawaiians that Native Hawaiians remember more. The events of 1893 and 1898, the occupation and the purported annexation of Hawaii to the United States. Those are the attacks that Hawaiians remember. So I wanted to thank you. I want to thank you for your presence and for your listening, and I look forward to talking to you and any questions that you might have about this incredible story and how it matters the way that we remember this war and other wars. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Chang, for that incredible lecture. I think it's a very important conversation to have, looking at the different perspectives on history, looking at how major historical events are viewed from different lenses, particularly with people groups. So as we go into our live Q&A portion, we will be taking questions from both Zoom and Facebook from our audience members. So if you have any questions watching on Zoom, please place them within the Q&A feature. If you're watching on Facebook, please place them within the comments as well. And just so you guys know, we're grateful for you guys putting in questions already so that we can go ahead and jump right on in. So David, you touched on the distinction between an American territory and an American state. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how that distinction impacts American citizenship and also how it impacted what would happen during World War II?
Yeah, it's a really important difference in terms of just understanding, if you will, kind of how vested the people inside of that space may be in the United States government. I mean, it's all very complicated because all of the United States, pretty much all of the United States territory is land that was taken over, right? Including the lower 48 and Alaska from indigenous people, right? So we can put it all within a long colonial history that was often termed territorial expansion, but we can put it all within that history. That being said, when you ask this, so I just want to kind of like, in some ways, break down the difference between territory and state there. But to get to the specifics of the question, in terms of citizenship, at this time, people who were born within the territory of Hawaii were citizens of the United States. They did have citizenship, but the territory that they inhabited did not have equal rights to states at that time. And another kind of an important part of this story also is because there was such a large Asian population in Hawaii, Asians were ineligible for citizenship, and Asian immigrants were ineligible to attain citizenship, to become naturalized, and that mattered more in Hawaii even than it did elsewhere in the United States because of the large Asian population. But citizenship law was not substantially different here. There was a second part of the question, however.
There were some comments on Facebook related to that distinction of American citizenship with statehood versus is American citizenship guaranteed with territory annexation?
Yeah, under constitutional law, since some decisions that were made in the early 20th century, citizenship did follow. Basically what the metaphor was often the flag. But that didn't mean that the territories themselves had equal rights within American government.
So thinking about the topic of annexation as well, we have a question from Zoom from Deborah, which is, do you think the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii would have been conquered or annexed by another foreign power prior to 1941 if the US had not? If so, which?
That's a really good question. And on the one hand, you could say, yeah, maybe. You know what I mean? A lot of smaller countries, a lot of island countries in the Pacific were. Many have regained their independence. This is a very important thing to keep in mind. That, for example, the Philippines is an independent country. There is an independent Samoa. There's an independent Tonga. There are independent countries, island nations in the Pacific that, yes, were occupied and then regained. Now, who could have occupied it? The main contenders were probably the British, who at one point in the 1840s seized control of the islands briefly before having to return it. The French, who had ambitions in the 19th century. The Japanese, who had ambitions as well. And then, of course, the United States. So any of them could have. Probably the likeliest candidates of the 20th century would have been the English and then later the Japanese. So could another country have occupied it? Yes. But I want to kind of reorient our vision towards the look of the rest of the Pacific and see Hawaii as one of many countries, some of which become occupied and many of which have regained their independence.
Absolutely. So Elizabeth from Facebook asks, she's curious to know how America was interfering in Japanese territories ahead of Pearl Harbor, and could that have been a motivating factor in why they attacked Hawaii?
First of all, I just want to say there are people here, I would guess almost everyone present in this conversation understands the strategic history of World War II better than I do, because that's not the kind of history that I do. So, but one thing is, let's look at it from a perspective. The Japanese thought, the US was not really taking on the Japanese Empire in the Pacific prior to December 7, 1941. And so that's not really why they did it. My understanding is that the Japanese wanted to preempt what they thought was going to be an inevitable opposition from the United States in the Pacific to territories that they had either long occupied or had recently taken over. And so it's not so much that the US was getting involved, but Japan expected that it was going to. And then also the Japanese were, for example, they looked at the places that the United States had already occupied as interference in places, I think, that they consider their imperial sphere of influence. So the United States has forces in Hawaii. The United States has forces in the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, okay, all these places. And it's not that Japan had occupied those, but Japan was worried about the presence of the US on not literally the doorstep, because the spaces here are enormous because it's marine space, but who were getting, if you will, too close for comfort, given what the Japanese wanted to do in the Pacific.
So we have another question from Zoom from Stephen, and it goes back a little bit further to the late 19th century. So what is the population of Hawaii now compared to 1898? And also, what happened to the last queen of Hawaii after annexation? And was she also a composer of music?
Great questions. The population of Hawaii is much larger now than it was at the turn of the 21st century. And I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. And I'd Google them up, but you'd be sitting there watching me Google, and nobody really wants to see me do that. The population's expanded very dramatically. The population's also changed. The proportion of Native Hawaiians in the population declined for a long time. The number of Native Hawaiians has been rising now for some time. Kind of in the late 20th and into the 21st century, the proportion of the population that is Hawaiian has really come back quite a bit. The proportion of the population changed in that, so the numbers of the population changed, the Hawaiian population declined, and then it's again on the rise. The rise of the populations that were not plantation in origin or Native Hawaiian in origin has changed. It was once a population that was largely Native Hawaiian and then Asian on top of that, Asian kind of settler labor that came later after that, or Asian contract labor that came after that, and then kind of a smaller but economically and politically powerful white population. That's really changed a lot. The white population is much larger than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. The population has grown more diverse in terms of Latino and African American population. There are new migrants from the Pacific. It's a very dynamic and changing kind of a population. But figures, I'm going to ask people to look those up themselves. In terms of what happened to Queen Liliuokalani, she continued to, she lived, and she was imprisoned for some time. She was stripped and of her home at the palace. She was referred to as Mrs. Rather than Queen, by Americans who didn't want to recognize her political role anymore. However, she continued to live, and she advocated very strongly for the rights of Hawaiian people, and and she protested vigorously against American purported annexation of Hawaii. So she remained a political figure, a cultural figure, and a leader in the community, even though she no longer held the political power she once did.
So I guess jumping into World War II specifically, with the rapidization of military expansion on the Hawaiian Islands during World War II, how did Native Hawaiians who did not serve in the military view the war?
Wow, you know what? We need to learn a lot more about that through careful research. So first I'm going to say that we don't know enough about that, but what we do know is that it was is somewhat anecdotal at this point. So in other words, we don't have systematic research, but it was a dramatic transformation, and many people were perhaps alarmed at what was going on. There's all of these people coming through, and soldiers who are there for a few months are not generally known to be the best behaved people in an urban environment. Okay, so you have to imagine it's not only the Native Hawaiian population, but kind of the resident population in general. Sometimes all of these people, all of these young men were looked on with alarm because of the trouble, that they could cause, fights, assaults on women, right? This was real. Then also it was just transforming. So I think that things were changing so quickly. At the same time, many people, Hawaiians and others, were very alarmed by the bombing on Pearl Harbor, and were scared. And so you do have, I see that there are a couple of questions about Hawaiians and their service in the war and that sort of a thing, who really wanted and were committed to the effort to fight the Japanese. So there's concern about change. There's the change. There's engaging in support of the military action, and then there's people who it seems to have intensified urbanization. Why? Okay, so what that means is there's jobs in Honolulu, okay, and there's going to be jobs at Hickam, and there's going to be jobs at Pearl Harbor, and there's going to be jobs at these places. So just like elsewhere in the United States, you have people moving towards urban places, to shipyards, to bases where there's civilian employment. So it changes Hawaii in that way as well, accelerates. And Native Hawaiians are a big part of that.
Absolutely. And we'll get a little bit more onto how that impacts statehood in just a little bit. But I do have a question about how were Native Hawaiians viewed by Americans during the war? Was it similar to how Americans viewed Japanese Americans?
No, it's actually largely very different. Hawaii, and I'm not sure that the war changed this so much. Hawaii was already a figment Okay, it was not a figment, but it loomed large in kind of white American imagination in the early 20th century. Okay, it was exotic. There was hula. There were traveling hula troops. There were traveling Hawaiian music troops, and lots of Americans were into Hawaiian music. There was a big Hawaiian music craze in the 1920s. Shellac Records, 78 Records, playing Hawaiian music by Hawaiian artists, playing Hawaiian steel guitar. If you're interested in this stuff, I recommend the work of Professor John Troutman. And so Hawaii was this exotic, far off place. And Hawaiians were seen as in a romantic, sexualized, and racially inferior way, in a way that I don't think really should surprise most of us. So people thought about hula girls and beach boys and savage warriors. Okay, so that's kind of the image. And happy-go-lucky natives. That was kind of the racist imaginary of Native Hawaiians. I don't think that changed very much with World War II. In World War II, and then after, Hawaii is an important place for R&R for soldiers as well, right? So the tourist industry is also tied to the military. And the presentation of kind of the tourist luau or the tourist hula show kind of promulgated these ideas. They were already present, they accelerated. So I think that's probably how it made Hawaiians even more present in the imagination. Yeah.
So we have a question from Jeremy from Zoom, and it is, can you comment on the service of Native Hawaiians in the war, in particular, their motivations for serving?
In that war and in other wars. So I think that, again, Jeremy, excellent question. We need to do more research on the specific motivations of the young people who served in the military. Again, I'm going to be speaking somewhat anecdotally and with some guesses here, okay? Hawaiians have served in disproportionate numbers, much like Native Americans, in America's wars, okay? And in the Second World War, but also in Vietnam. I remember going to Washington, D.C. with my father, and him going straight to the names that start with K, because so many of Hawaiian names begin with K, to see the names of the many, many Hawaiians who served in Vietnam and who died in Vietnam. Okay, but in World War II, there was a particular belief that this was a war of defense. Okay, and this is complicated because the Japanese Empire did attack Hawaii. Now, I've said it didn't attack America. It didn't attack the United States territory itself, the United States itself, but it did truly attack Hawaii. And this was very alarming to many Hawaiians who took that attack seriously. And I do believe that some young people joined to defend Hawaii, okay, from Japanese expansion and takeover, which is a little bit different from defending the United States, right? And historians of American Indians in the military have really pointed this out, that just because an American Indian soldier is fighting with the US Army uniform and in the US Army doesn't mean that the prime motivation is to defend the United States, but perhaps to defend their homeland. This, I think, is the question we need to ask ourselves of many Native Hawaiian soldiers. Some, no doubt, identified as Americans and fought as Americans and as American patriots, right? I have no doubt that that was the case for some Native Hawaiians. And then frankly, also, so you've got the draft, right? You've got voluntary, you've got people joining up voluntarily. And then in all wars, there's the question of what do you do, right? And the difficult decisions of many, many young people figuring this out. So it's a great question. I want to know more about that too.
So looking ahead to statehood, Mark from Zoom had a fantastic question: is what was the influence of Native Hawaiian citizens on the move to statehood in the 50s?
Complicated question. There were many Hawaiians who were opposed to the imposition of statehood. There were some Hawaiians who were in favor of what they saw as perhaps gaining statehood or entry into statehood. So kind of the sense that Hawaii should not be a state had to do with annexation was not right. We are different from Americans. We are not Americans, even though, you know, there's US flags flying at our schools and at the post office and down at Pearl Harbor and at the Air Force Base. This is not America, we're not Americans, so we'd rather remain a territory. There was that sense, and there was opposition. There were also many people who probably saw it who did see it as a way to gain an equal enfranchisement, right? Equal political rights with other United States citizens who lived in the 48 states. And then, but here's the key thing is we don't know enough. There was a referendum in '59, right before the Statehood Act. And that referendum was, should Hawaii be, I'm gonna get the wording wrong, but should Hawaii be immediately, enter immediately into the United States as a state? That was the only question. Now, the vast majority of votes were in the affirmative, but a few things that have to be kept in mind about this. The proportion of Native Hawaiians in the population was much lower than it had been in, say, 1898. And everyone who was in Hawaii, all citizens could vote on this. And many Hawaiians have pointed out that when you're really questioning a colonized people about the political future of their land, it's not the norm to make this an open referendum. So what I'm trying to say is the data is not available as much as possible from that vote as one might think. I'd like to refer people who are interested in this question to a great book called Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood. And the author is Dean Saranilio, Saranilio. And he gets into the complications of this story really beautifully.
So before we get to our last question, I do want to thank everyone for your thoughtful questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them today, but to really end things, we had quite a few questions from Zoom related to what's the future for Hawaii? Is there a possibility of Hawaii getting these native lands back, potentially seceding from the United States? And what's the viability of that?
That's a good question, and I don't have a firm answer to it because, of course, I'm a historian and I'm better at the past than the future. However, as a historian, I can say the history is surprising, and things that we don't expect to happen do happen. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I want to lay out the complexities. In the same way that the French in 1950 probably never thought that Algeria was going to be independent, right? Or that the British in 1940 never thought that what we now call Nigeria was going to be independent. It seems unimaginable to many Americans today that Hawaii might one day be an independent country or have some other kind of a political status that's more independent than what it currently is. In other words, to gain some sort of other political status. It seems unimaginable right now. But again, just by citing a couple of cases, the world is surprising, right? And things and the political status of places does change. Hawaii has a strong movement for sovereignty. There's a strong political movement among Native Hawaiians for sovereignty. And that can mean a lot of things. For some people, it means an independent country. Again, an independent Hawaiian nation. For others, it means some sort of another halfway status. So there's a popular movement. There's a legal question that's very important to hear. And I referred to it briefly during the talk. In 1898, there was no treaty of annexation ever ratified by the United States. Okay? So the United States had treaties with the independent Kingdom of Hawaii, and they recognized each other and they were allies. And then all of a sudden, there's a caretaker overtake government that comes in from the coup, the Republic, which Hawaii, the United States also recognizes. And then the United States, without any treaty, passes something called the Newlands Resolution, whereby Congress, that is the House and the Senate, have a joint resolution and say, okay, Hawaii is now ours. The thing is, that's not how annexation works. So legally, the annexation of Hawaii is altogether specious. Okay. Now, turning law into reality when you're talking about one of the most militarily important places in the world is a different question. So is it possible for Hawaii to regain its independence? I would say yes. I would say yes. Is that a hard thing? Are there some real impediments here? I would also say yes, because the United States, right or wrong, whatever a court might say, whatever the UN might say, whatever the United States Supreme Court could conceivably say, if these arguments were brought to them about the illegality of annexation, or perhaps the legal nullity of annexation. The fact is that Pearl Harbor is not just historically important, it is one of the most important military installations in the world. So that's why remembering Pearl Harbor makes a lot of sense, because Pearl Harbor doesn't only matter for the past, it matters a lot for the future. And the political and the military status of that, and also Hickam Air Force Base and other military installations in Hawaii. That's, I would say, going to be a crux of a problem. Countries become independent and people have joint citizenship sometimes. Residents can gain citizenship in different ways. Money can be worked out. There's a lot of things can be worked out. But America's military commitment to Pearl Harbor and the benefit that it gets from that domination is real, and it's worth thinking hard about. And so I was glad to be able to talk about the importance of that in the past. And now we can think about it, how it matters in the future.
Absolutely. So David, thank you so much for joining us today and for providing this insightful perspective on the attack at Pearl Harbor.
I really appreciated the chance to talk with you all. And I know there were a ton of questions that we didn't get to, but I encourage people to keep reading and keep learning about this. And I thank them for coming here. And thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Absolutely. And so I also want to thank each and every one of our audience members for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this lecture, please make sure to check out our website as well as our social media, especially our Facebook page, for more upcoming programs and lectures. So take care, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon here at the National World War II Museum.